Hello, everybody. Good morning. How was the keynote? Yeah? Yeah? A little bit long? Was it late? Was it running late? That's when you know a keynote is good, when it runs late. So thank you for being here. Let me tell you a little bit of context of this session. This session is impossible to do. It's literally impossible. It's an overview of the application platform for developers, right? How can you fit that in 1 hour? There's no way, right? So I think my goal here is not going, I will try, I need to go deep sometimes, right? So I will try to do a couple of things that are a little bit deeper so we have a little bit fun and it's not like slides all the time. But the idea is to give you guys an overview end to end so you know everything that is happening, at least from very, very high level. And then we go in a couple of places in a little bit more depth. My name is David Carmona, and I work as a principal PM in the developer division. So our division is the one doing Visual Studio, .NET, Team Services, Xamarin, and all the good stuff for developers, right? And we have a lot of fun with you guys. So how many of you are developers here? Can you raise your hands? Nice. Okay, you are in the right session. So the first thing that I say when I start talking, because where do you even start when you have to introduce the Microsoft development platform? You don't even know where to start. I like to start with the developer role, right? And I know that this is a little bit abstract, but this is, between us. We have a cool job. This is, we used to say it a lot, but it's not only that it's a cool job, it's also how much our companies need us, right? So we are like in the center of that innovation, and good news for us, they need that innovation, right? So the center now of the innovation of any company is the development, is software, is the digital transformation, right? And that is for us cool, but at the same time, a big responsibility, right? Because let's be clear, the development is not something that is easy, right? So just because it's cool and we have fun sometimes in our job, doesn't mean that it's an easy job. I was chatting with some of you before the session, and the general feeling is this thing is getting more complex instead of easier. How can we manage to make this thing more complex instead of the opposite? Every industry in the world gets easier over time. Our industry is getting more difficult over time, right? So that's something for us to think, and that definitely has an impact on the way that Microsoft is looking at that development platform, because we hear you every day on that complexity. The other thing, so by the way, the example that I always use for how important a developer is just looking at some companies out there, right? So you see every of these cases, it was software, the one which moved completely an industry and completely changed the market, right? So software was the one behind any of these companies that displaced completely another company that was leading, right? So so it has that side of the coin as well, right? So we have huge responsibility, and not only that, we are the key factor for differentiation, but also the key factor for failure if we don't do it right? So that's for us to have in our mind every day. So then, what does it mean really? So what are the big challenges that we have? So yeah, we're in the center of the innovation. Yeah, so what? What are we being asked to do, right? And of course, each of you are being asked to do something very different, which is also interesting how we have to do so many different things. But there are recurrent themes that I see all the time, right, with developers. And one of them is a big pressure that we're getting. Let me put it in a positive way. Let's call it, instead of pressure, let's call it opportunity, right? So we have a huge opportunity that we see in every company, and it's moving from this functional app that we've been creating for years to something very different that really has a nice, beautiful, amazing experience. And that is not UI, that is more than that. That is things like embracing mobile, things like consumerization of those applications, right? So tremendous pressure that we have to move our business into that area, right? The other one clearly is the cloud. But the cloud, not that, I think now we are in a moment where the cloud is not really because I have to. I think we all understand that the cloud is the place to go, right? So we all have that pressure that, hey, I need to, so I'm behind my competitors if I don't leverage the cloud, right? And leveraging the cloud, now the conversation is more about how I can leverage that cloud, but extending my existing business. So this is not something about moving some workloads to the cloud. This is really about fully leveraging the cloud, extending my business to it, right? And then the third one that I think I see all the time has more to do with the how we as developers develop. And those old days of, hey, we are starting a new project in the company is called blah, and the timeline is 2 years. In 2 years, we're gonna deliver this project. What was the last time that you heard that? I've been in many projects that was a 2 years project, right? Never again. We never had 2 years for creating a project anymore, right? So projects are in continuous evolution, and we have the first deliverable in 3 months. And then we are continuously, every week, we are delivering new capabilities, right? And that's something that dramatically changes the way that we as developers create that software, right? And that has implication not only on the architecture of the applications that we have to do, but also on how we develop those applications. So looking at that, if you now look at very high level, to the Microsoft solution, it aligns very well. So a way of looking the Microsoft platform, it aligns very well with those 3 things, right? Why? Because you have a whole set of platforms and tools for you to create those experiences that are gonna impact your end user. And then, of course, we have all the cloud platforms for you to extend the business to the cloud, right? And then in the middle, something that we do, which is not really a platform, so I'm not even gonna have a section about that. It's like embedded, it's infused in every platform that we do in Microsoft. You have the concept of continuous agility, right? You have the concept of DevOps, for example, how you can deliver those applications with agility. And those are sprinkles that we have across the platform, so everything comes together for you to be able to embrace the new cycle, this super quick cycle of developing applications. So this is the way that I'm structuring this session, right? So I have a first section where I'm going to talk about the first area, rich experiences, and I have a second section that is going to talk a lot about cloud, and then on both of them, I'm going to talk about how to do each of them with agility, with DevOps. In one case, mobile DevOps, and in the other case, cloud DevOps. Sounds good? Yeah? Okay, let's go to it. So let's start with mobility. I don't need to tell you this, right? But just in case anybody didn't notice, yeah, this is not going to be easy. Mobility is not about one OS. Mobility is not about one device. Everybody knows that, right? So any analyst will tell you that at the very least 3, that's the average on any enterprise, but it's getting even higher and higher because of things like IoT, right? So this is another one of those things that are not going to become easier, but just the opposite, right? So we'll have more and more form factors, more and more devices, and more and more different OSs that I need to target, right? And that's a challenge, right? So there are 2 approaches to this, right? So if you have been developing for mobility in the past, you have 2 approaches. You can go native. That's a perfectly fine approach, right? Now, when you go native, the way that I like to look at this when I make that decision is by comparing, hey, this axis is about my experience as a developer, so how productive am I gonna be if I pick this technology? The other angle is how is going to be the experience for the end user. So how rich is going to be the experience for that end user, right? And native, I mean, let's be clear, is providing an amazing experience for end users, right? So you can achieve everything that you want with a mobile application that is developed natively, right? So any API, any UX, anything you can accomplish with a native application. The problem is that with this proliferation of different devices, different form factors, and different OSs, how do I get productivity if I go native, right? So it's not affordable for the regular enterprise. Yes, it's affordable for Uber and Netflix, but as mortals, how can we afford having a different code base for every single device that we target, right? That's very, very challenging. And not only that, even the tools that I'm going to have and the abilities that I'm going to have on each of those devices is challenging. I mean, creating a full native application is challenging on any OS that you are targeting, right? So then you go, okay, so let's go to the other side. The other side that is very popular, especially in the enterprise, is I go hybrid, right? So I create, using Cordova or using PhoneGap, I will create this HTML application that is using a frame that it looks and it behaves like it's native, but it's not native. It's in the inner side, is HTML and CSS, right? And great news, my productivity goes to the roof, right? Why? Because I only have to write once, and I can reuse that directly. The problem is that I'm sacrificing the end user experience, right? So I'm using, in most cases, the common denominator of those platforms, and things like getting access to every single API gets more challenging in those applications, in those platforms, and we have that duality that is difficult to manage, right? So in Microsoft, we provide those two, right? So you know that you have the ability to target Windows on a native way, and we have Cordova tools as part of Visual Studio that you can target iOS, Android, and Windows with Cordova, right? So we provide that. But we also have something for this middle area, right? And that is Xamarin, right? So if you know Xamarin, I won't go in detail, but because probably you all know it, but Xamarin allows us to have the best of both worlds, right? So it's a native platform, so everything that you do is native, meaning that you have access to all the APIs. There's not a single API in iOS, Android, or Windows, of course, that you cannot get access to it, right? So that's important. The second thing is that it has native performance. So you can do things like great UI, you can do things like immersive experiences as part of those platforms. And the third thing is that it has access to all the native controls. So it looks like an application for that particular platform, not something that is across all the platforms the same, right? So that's the end user side. But then the developer side is like everybody's happy because Xamarin, as you know, is all.NET. And that means that I have all the productivity of C#. That means that I can reuse all the code if I want to. Actually, Xamarin has something very interesting, which is your ability to dial the level of code that you want to reuse, right? So you can say, hey, I want to go 100%, right? That means that I can use Xamarin Forms, which is an abstraction on the UI, and I can use all the libraries in C#, and I can just use exactly the same application, the same code across all the devices. But I can go the other way and say, no, I want to have a screen for every single device, and I want it to be different, right? I can go that direction by using the native capabilities, the native UI platform of that device. That's another option. And then everything in between. You can say, no, I'm going to use Xamarin Forms with some controls on every platform that I'm going to customize depending on the device that I'm targeting, right? So that on top of this is .NET, meaning that not only I can reuse code between all the devices, but I can also reuse code with my other client applications, like, for example, desktop, or even more amazing with the server side. So I can, for example, share the same entities across my server side and my client side, which is interesting, right? So this is Xamarin. I think the best way of looking at Xamarin, and this is the moment where I go a little bit deeper for just 1 second, is showing it to you just a little bit. So I want to spend, I don't have a lot of time to show a lot of Xamarin. There's a session, not sure if it's today or tomorrow, but there's a session on Xamarin, so you can go deeper there. But let me show you a little bit how it works, right? So this is interesting because my mouse is not working. Okay, touchpad moment. This is going to be ugly. So I have here Visual Studio already. So I created already a Xamarin application. The way, so just to show you how I did it, File, New Project. And in here, you have all the OSs, right? So you can create an iOS application in the C# node, for example, right? That's an iOS app, or I can create an Android app. But even more interesting, what I did in this case was a cross-platform app. So in this case, this is a template that will create all the different projects for all the different devices in a very nice structure. So that project, when you create it, I didn't do anything different. You have this. Let me zoom in here so you can see it better. So you can see that that template is creating a solution that has 4 projects. One for Android, one for iOS, one for UWP. That's where you're going to put all the code that really is targeting one specific device. And then you have another one, which is portable, that goes across the 3 of them. Now, by default, you can have everything on the portable one, right? So actually, in this particular case, the portable one is the one that has the UI. So you can see here the SAML page. That is a Xamarin Forms page that I have in my shared code. So I'm also sharing the code of my UI, right? But if I want to have here, I could have only the entities and the logic, and I can directly in here, for example, in the UWP, I can have my SAML UWP native UI, right? So I can play with those 2 approaches. In this case, what I have is this SAML in here, which is this one that I have open here. This is an abstraction on top of the different platforms, right? Now, the cool things about this approach is that I can still mix whether I want to go across all the devices or I want to use a specific control or a specific capability in one device, right? So that's the power of Xamarin Forms. So, for example, in this case, by the way, I'm using VS 2017 in this demo, so you can download the RC already from the website. And one of the things that you will see in that preview is that in that release candidate is new capabilities for Xamarin. One of them is what you see here. So this window that you see here, that is a Xamarin previewer. So you can play with your Xamarin Forms on the left. So, for example, I can, what did I do? So you see that it's changing in real time, or I can do a rotation -40, right? So I can do whatever I want, right? Now, the cool thing of Xamarin Forms, let me show you something. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import a namespace. Let me show you this namespace in here. So this namespace that I just imported is an assembly that is Xamarin.ios. Xamarin.ios is the namespace or the assembly with all the API for iOS projected to C#, right? So what I'm basically doing is now that I added that reference, I can use anything in that assembly, meaning I can use any control that is defined in native iOS, right? So for example, instead of this one here, I'm going to remove this one, and I'm going to use a native map. So this is the native iOS map, right? The one that you would use on an Xcode application. So once I do that, let me run this thing. So I'm running this thing on a local simulator. So one of the things that is coming with VS 2017 is a local iOS simulator that is doing remoting to another Mac OS, right? But you don't have to switch between machines or anything like that. So directly from your Windows machine, you can develop and you can emulate an iOS device. 2017, yeah. Yeah, the question was that in 2017? Yeah, it's part of 2017. Do I have connection here? Did I lose the connection with the emulator? Let's do it. Let's give it another chance. So let's think what is happening here, right? So what I just did in a Xamarin Forms that allows me to go across all the devices, I added a native control that only exists in iOS, right? So the key question here, so if I do this on an Android device, what would it happen? And you will see that what it happens is that, of course, that control won't show up. So you have the ability now to create sections that apply to each particular device. So you have it's like the best of both worlds, right? So this is a native iOS map. The cool thing is that because this is running on my Surface, I have multi-touch, right? So I can even with my fingers. I think this lost the connection again. Okay, so you saw the concept, right? So I'm having some connectivity issues here between the two laptops. So directly in my Windows machine, I can develop iOS, Android, and Windows applications, and I can go native with them or reuse as much code as I want, right? That's the core concept. But do you think that's everything? Do you think that's all you need to create an application in multiple devices? And this is where we move into what we said before, right? What about the agility? What about my ability to continuously create, to continuously deliver this application? That's trickier, right? And that's where you have things like, so on any other platform, you need to think about things like, how do you build that? How do you continuously build this application, right? So how do you set up a continuous integration and continuous deployment environment with a mobile application? How do I test that application? How do I make sure that that application is going to work not only in my simulator, but also on all the different devices, not only for a particular platform, but for any platform, right? So how do I make sure that this is working on all their Android devices, or the newest iOS device, right, or the newest Windows UWP PC, right? So how do I manage all of that, right? How do I distribute this application? How do I measure the analytics? How do I close the loop? So crash analytics. So all of that, I need a solution that can help me to achieve all of that, right? And the traditional approach is, yeah, there are tools everywhere for each of these items, right? So you can mix and match from out there, and you will have a Frankenstein in there that you may be able to be successful, right? But our idea is, let's make sure that, of course, we have all these services available for you as individual services. So each of the services that you see here, you have that available, and you can use it just by itself, and you can mix and match with other services. But we're also coming with all these services together in what we call Visual Studio Mobile Center. So Visual Studio Mobile Center is basically a collection of services that will help you not only on the development of the application, but also the entire life cycle of that application, right? So let me show it to you super quickly. How does it look like? So I have in here, again, touchpad. So this is a Mobile Center. So you see that it's very basic interface. So you see that there's a button up there, Add New Application. Let's click there. So this is going to let me create a new application. And the first thing that I can see is, so the application, I can use any framework, right? So it's not only Xamarin, and that's something important. So if you are using anything, like, for example, native Objective-C or Swift for Xcode, you could use it here. In this case, let's click on Xamarin. The next thing that is asking you, so we said that one of the things on this, when we want to achieve agility, is continuous integration, right? So this is allowing you to set up continuous integration for mobile applications. And that is challenging if you want to do it by yourself, right? So that means that this thing is going to connect to that repo, to the repo that I'm going to select, for example, that one in here. And every time that I make a change on that repo, it's going to get the sources, and it's going to build the native application for me. And building a native application, as you know, is not simple, right? So it includes, so if it's an iOS application, it will include running this on a Mac device, right? If it's an Android application, we have to deal with the Java SDK, right? So not simple to set up that, right? So I can click in here, and you can see that the things that it's asking me is basically what's the solution in that repo, and then when do you want to build that solution, right? Every push, so every time that I do a change on that repo, it will trigger a new build, or on demand, right? So I just click when I want it to, I want it to be built. The next thing that it's asking me, and this is the other thing that I said before, right? So if it builds, that doesn't mean that it works, right? Especially on the mobile world. How do you know if that application is going to behave the same way on every single device that is out there? So that's where we bring the Xamarin Test Cloud, right? So Xamarin Test Cloud allows you to run your application on hundreds of thousands of different device models all in the cloud, so you don't have to have them in your office, right? So it's as easy as selecting the devices. You just need to click on the devices that you want it to run, and then depending on how far you want to go, you have also the ability to create your own tests, like, hey, your script on Word, the automation script for that particular test, and then it will upload the application, the test, and it will run it for you after every build, right? So you not only know that the application builds, but also that it works on every device. And the last thing is the distribution, right? So once I test the application, how do I distribute that application, right? And you can do it directly to the corresponding app store of that particular device, but usually what you're gonna do is having different groups of beta testers or internal people that will help you to test the application before going to the App Store, right? And in this case, you can see that I can define groups of people, and I just need to click on the relevant groups, and the application will be automatically deployed to those devices once it's built and tested, right? So everything so far, so good. So I'm not gonna create this application because I have one here with some data on it. So you can see here that I have things like build. So this is my log of the latest builds for this application, all in the cloud, right? And I have, depending on the branch, I have a branch that failed, so I can see that directly in there, right? So that is the centralized build. And that is just the surface, right? Because the cool thing that I have in here, for example, is test. So for those applications, for those builds that succeed, I have complete information on how the test of those applications went in this cloud of devices, right? So let me click on one of them that didn't go well. For example, this one here. So I can see here, for example, that this particular test, the sign up test, didn't work, and I can go through the steps. You can see that as I go through the steps, I have screenshots, right, of my application. These are real screenshots that happen on real devices that I don't have, right? So this is the test that was executed in that script, so I can see all the steps in there. I have also the option to see the video, but in this case, what I can see is that this particular step didn't work on a particular device, on an iPhone 4S. Who knows why, right? So now I can go there and see exactly the logs and all the traceability that I have of that particular device, right? So you see all the power of the testing cloud. What about distribution? So for distribution, it's easy, right? So it will let you know where is the application right now. So is the QA has that particular version, collaborators have another version. But the cool part of it is that I can see the analytics, right? So in this case, let's go, for example, for crashes. So I can see the crashes that my users are having with this particular application, right? So in this case, I can see here an exception. The index was outside of the bounds, blah, blah, blah. I can see the struct trace in there. I can see all the information that I need to really fix that issue. And I have also the ability to see analytics, right? So all my daily sessions, duration, distribution by device. I can have my own events, so I can say, hey, every time that I do something in my application, like I add a team or something like that, I have an event, right? So all of that information, all in one dashboard, right? So the perfect solution integrated for you to have that end-to-end view on the application. So this is VS Mobile Center, but this is just half of it, because now we move to the cloud, right? And so most of you were in the keynote, right? So you know how the cloud is really transforming the businesses, right? So I'm not gonna go there. I'm just gonna talk about practically for us developers, what does it mean, right? And the way that I like to look at it is by, so I'm pretty sure that none of us in this room will say today or that particular day. I perfectly remember on January 21st, 2014, I was in the cloud. I made it. I was funning in the cloud. There's that probably in another context, like our managers, they may think that, right? But that is not the reality. Cloud is a journey, and we take steps to the cloud. And you are never fully 100% in the cloud. Actually, you are probably, depending on your application, you have your feet in different places, right? So different places of maturity. So this is not as easy as just say, boom, I am in the cloud, right? And the way, simplifying a lot that journey to the cloud, the way that I see that journey happening a lot, in different phases depending on the application, so it's not the whole company doing these steps at the same time, but you have, of course, coming from on-premises, then you see that the first step is how you embrace the cloud infrastructure, so IaaS, things like VMs in the cloud, and then you go what I call born in the cloud, right? It's like when I introduce like the metrics, when you see everything in the cloud, right? And now you have all your applications leveraging, really, truly leveraging the cloud, right? And that has a lot to do with how I use the cloud as a platform and not just only as infrastructure. And that has a lot to do on even how I architecture my applications, right? And we're going to talk about that a little bit for a minute now with microservices. But when you are in that, when you see the metrics, right, the benefits that you usually see is, so one of them simple, IT costs, right? So the reality is that when you go PaaS, you are fully cloud native, which means that you are leveraging all the performance and you are optimized for the cloud. So that immediately is cost savings, right? So the factor of utilization of a VM in the cloud has nothing to do with something like app service where you only pay for what you are using, right? Then, of course, you have even deeper transformations like how quick you can develop, right? So PaaS is not only about abstracting the infrastructure, it's also about giving you services, right, that you can use. So that allows you to build on top of services that are part of Azure, and therefore, development costs can go down, right? And then the last one is agility. So if you do this in a way that allows you to deploy very fast, that allows you to deploy each piece independently, that means that you are able to do the same thing that we did before with mobile, but now in the server side, how I can continuously develop and deploy my individual services to the cloud, right? So we did a research with Forrester. And this is Azure, so this went to Azure customers, and we basically partnered with Forrester to identify what was the benefit of those customers that were moving from IaaS to PaaS, right? And the two numbers that I especially interested are the two on the right, because those are the ones that affect us, right? So 80% IT time saved, that's us, that's time that we save. Right, so that's cool, 80%. And 50% faster time to market, that means less time developing, right? So that's us as well, right? So that is, and those are numbers from analysis on real customers, right? So those are very eye-opening on what we can achieve if we are in this born in the cloud phase, right? So now let's take a look to Azure. So I can bring, and you probably saw that slide with all the services in Azure, right? So that slide is like mind-blowing, like, oh my God, so many services in here, where do I even start, right? So if I want to simplify to the max for us developers, what is Azure for applications? I could summarize in those 4 layers, and it's a super simplified version, right? But are the 4 core services for you to create applications on top of Azure. Below this one, this is like a layer structure, because below all of this, you have IaaS, right? So below ACS, you can assume that you can always go to the metal and do VMs on Azure, right? Or scale sets, totally fine. But then, on top of that, you have different levels of abstractions on top of the platform, right? And the first level that I always look at it from an abstraction point of view on the VMs themselves is Azure Container Service. Azure Container Service allows you to embrace a microservice architecture or embrace basically a place for you to manage, scale, and orchestrate your microservices with containers on top of VMs, right? And it's the very first step of abstraction that you can achieve with Azure. So you don't have to manage things like moving containers or managing those containers or scaling them on top of the VMs. The next one is Azure Container Service doesn't solve a lot of development challenges that you have when you are embracing a cloud-native architecture. So think of managing state, managing identification, managing all the issues, logging, all the issues that you have where you are in a so distributed architecture as Azure Container Service, right? So That's why if you want to get abstraction on top of that, if you want to get an abstracted platform that will take care of things like those for you, that's Service Fabric, right? So you can use that to get a different level of productivity. Then you can say, you know what, at the end, I'm not creating a high-scale microservice, hundreds of microservices architecture. I'm creating a web application. I'm creating the front end of that application, or I'm creating the services for a mobile application. I'm creating web and mobile applications. Then you have a different abstraction layer that is app service. If you are creating a web or a mobile application, app service will give you a much higher abstraction that will help you create your application tailored for that particular scenario. Now, if you are creating the next, you are working on a bank and you are creating your microservice architecture for all the back end of the bank, then that's not app service. That probably would be something like Service Fabric. But if you're creating a higher scale web application or mobile application, app service is perfect for that. Right? Then on top of that, even if you want to abstract even more, and you don't even want to care, you don't even want to be focused on things like services, you go to functions. And in functions, you don't even have the concept of a server. You don't even have the concept of managing anything. So function is just a piece of code that you tell Azure to execute. It will execute it for you, and it will return. That's it. That's function. And you don't have to care about the concurrency or setting thresholds on CPU for when it's needed to spin a new instance of that, for example, app service, or going down container. All of that is being done by Azure, right? And you only pay per usage. So you don't have to worry about the service behind it. So let's do some demos so we can get these concepts. I'm going to start top down. So I'm going to start with the highest level of abstraction with functions, and then I'm going to go deeper on that. Okay? So functions. I have here, I can close this one already. So I have here, I'm already in the Azure portal, I'm in a function there. In this case, I have a function already created, but before I go into that function, let me create one for you, because it's super easy. So, oh, the mouse is back. Awesome. So you have already predefined templates for functions. In this case, I'm going to create, in my opinion, the simplest one, which is a simple HTTP trigger. So these are templates. We'll see how you can customize those templates, but you can think of a function like a piece of code that is executed in the cloud when something happens, right? And that something happening is the input trigger, right? So you have to define that input trigger. And you have multiple ones. So you see in there, you have things like, hey, when something arrives in a queue, or when there's a webhook triggering in some other service, or where something is stored in a blob storage, anything, something, an event in Event Hub. In this case, the HTTP trigger is when an HTTP request comes, right? So it's the easiest, the simplest of the triggers. So once I do that, let me just create it. And I'm going to go, so you see that there are 4 things in here. I'm going to go, instead of showing the code, I will do that in a second, I'm going to show the triggers, right, the integration part of it. So this is where I can customize this template to tell Azure when is this function going to be executed and what is going to be the output, so where it's going to be connected to. In this case, super simple. When there's an HTTP request, it's triggered, it executes, and the output goes to another, so in the return of that HTTP request. So a service, right? So this is really at the end, all of this, we just created an API, a web API, right? So it's that simple. But I have the ability to change it, right? So I can delete this one. And you can see here all the triggers. You have timers, events, file. Let me go back to the HTTP one. OK, so those are the triggers, right? Now, the code. So the code, I have 2 options for writing this code. I can do it here in the browser. That's an option. So there's as you see, there's an in-browser experience for creating the code. We also have a tooling for Visual Studio, right? So you can use Visual Studio, especially if this gets complex. I would recommend you to use Visual Studio because you have IntelliSense between, you can have multiple files, and it's much easier to manage, right? But in a case like this, which is literally hello world, I think this should be fine, right? So what this method is doing is logging some info, but it's basically taking a parameter here. So this is a parameter that is taken from that request, and is doing hello and that parameter. That's simple, right? So I can go in here. If I run it, by the way, let me add, before I run it, I'm going to add in here log.info. And I'm going to show the parameter, plus name. OK. So now I'm going to save it and run it. So there's like you see that this is a development environment, right? So even without having the trigger, I can always execute. So you can see here that this thing executed, and I have here parameter Azure because the parameter that it used was the string Azure, right? But the cool thing is not that. The cool thing is that I can take this, and this is a service that now I can ping, right? So I can come here, put this, and I have, and I think I have it in here already, Chicago, there you go. And this is a service, so I just added Chicago as the name parameter, and you see that it replied, right? Super simple, so I didn't have to set up any server, any plan, nothing at all, right? And I pay per usage, right? So super simple approach to create a microservice, so the highest level of abstraction. And I can do cool stuff. So in here I have an existing one. Let me show you this one here. This one is also a function. In this case, it's triggered. So if I go here to the integration, this is triggering when there's an image added to an Azure blob, so a particular Azure blob, whether anybody is adding in their file, this function will trigger, right? And the output will go also to another Azure blob storage, right? So what this function is doing is taking that. Let me show you this. So it's taking that file, is decoding that file to suppose that is an image, a JPEG image, right? And with that image is calling, and you can see that call a little bit down here, is calling cognitive services to get the sentiment of the person who's showing up in that image. So this is getting a little bit more complex, right? So taking the image in that service, calling an external services, and calling the emotion APIs as part of cognitive services, and then understanding the face that is in that particular image, whether it's happy, it's sad, it's surprised, whatever, right? And then depending on that, it's creating an image. You can see here, if it's surprise, I will use a different frame for that image. If it's angry, another one. If it's happy, another one, right? And that will save it in the output, in the blob storage. So at the end, the result is that if I go here, I have here the storage explorer, right? So this is the storage. This is the blob storage that is listening to, that the function is connected to, right? So once I'm here, I can, let me go in here. I think I have here a file with Hanselman very surprised. What is this? File. So I'm going to add this surprise Hanselman, right? Let me just drag it in here. So it's uploading it. Now I can go to this, and you can see that the function executed, right? And you see here all the parameters, all the output. And anger is low, contempt is low, disgust is low. But if you go to the right, you see surprise is the highest, right? So it worked. And with that information, the function created another image that is stored in another blob storage. I can double click to download it. And it created like this nice card with a surprise man, right? So that's Azure Functions, right? So there's no more abstraction than this. I mean, that is, yeah, I mean, we could think that probably there will be another layer of abstraction, but right now, if you want to do services in Azure, that is the highest level of abstraction that I think you can assume for developers. Let's go to the next one. So the next one is you want to go deeper to that kind of stack that we saw in the slide, right? So for the next one, I'm not going to use functions. I'm going to create an ASP.NET web API, right? And let's see what can I do with that, right? So now I'm going to switch to Visual Studio. I can close this solution. And I'm going to create a new project. File, new project. So some context in here. So this afternoon, I will be going much deeper on .NET Core for this particular session. And of course, everything that I'm doing here, I work in the .NET team, so I'm going to do everything with .NET, but you can assume that everything that I'm doing here, you can do with any other language, right? Like Node.js or Java or whatever you want, right? So Azure supports all of them. In this particular one, what I'm creating is ASP.NET Core application, right? And that has several advantages. Being one of them, as we will see for those who want to come, is cross-platform, right? So I can develop this and deploy it on any OS, right? Or not only on Windows, but also on Mac and more importantly, Linux, right? So that means that on top of the architecture of .NET Core makes it perfect for containers. So the challenge for this demo is I'm going to create a container based on an ASP.NET application. And we'll see what we can do with that. Okay. I think before doing that, let me do something. I'm going to go back to the slides just for a second. I think I need to do this first. I think I need to go a little bit before that and explain microservices, right? So how many of you are familiar with microservices? Half of you. Okay. So another buzzword, right? And as any buzzword, very careful with them, right? So don't jump into something just because everybody's talking about, right? So at the end, microservices, there are many ways to explain what is a microservice. I like this one. I like comparing to a non-microservice architecture, right? So we come from a world that we used to have the architecture that you see on the left, right? So we used to have monolithic applications that are separated into layers, right? Into functional layers. So you have a presentation layer, you have a backend with a business layer, and then you have data access on whatever layers you have in there, right? And that was a great architecture, and we've been using that architecture, and it's still a great application for a lot of different applications, right? Now, the issue of that architecture comes when we connect that with what was said before of agility, right? So now imagine that you want to be agile, that you want to continuously deploy and improve this application, right? The obvious way to do that is to make sure that you are embracing an agile organization, an agile development organization, which means you have more isolated, kind of independent, autonomous teams that are creating smaller chunks of that application and have continuous delivery on that chunk of the application, right? So imagine that you have, for example, I can talk about our case in the developer division in Microsoft. So we are like probably 1,500 people, more or less, and we don't have, so we have all the organization split in smaller teams, right? And every team is in a room, right? So we have shared rooms where every team from 10 to 15 members, they are sharing the room, and they have the entire responsibility of everything, from talking with the customer to creating the application, to testing the application, to deploy the applications, and then operate that application, learning from operations, and close the cycle to do the next iteration on that particular part of the application, right? So that is extremely agile, right? Because then you have those teams highly accountable for what they do and continuously creating those applications without these super long cycles of bringing everything in the organization together, right? That's the ideal world. That never happens, right? So you need a lot of orchestration always, right? But something, and this was, I think, I don't remember his name, but there's a nice quote it was from the 50s. Somebody saying that a product created from an organization mimics the structure of that organization. So usually, by looking at the product that is created by an organization, you can see how is the organization structured, right? So if you want to create a monolithic application, then you create a monolithic organization, right? The other way also works. So the only way for us to make sure that that model of independent, isolated, and autonomous teams working completely agile, the only way for that to happen is using an architecture that mimics that organization, which means microservices, right? So the other way of looking at microservices is a way for you to chunk your application in smaller pieces, each of them independent, not only from the functional point of view, but also from the operations point of view. So you should be able to deploy completely independent from the rest of microservices of your organization, one particular microservice. That's the magic of microservices, right? Because then you can have multiple microservices in an organization, each of them created by one particular team that can run by themselves, right? Now, that's the happy way of telling this story. The horror way of telling this story is the mess that this could be if it runs out of control, right? So imagine that each of those microservices are completely incompatible, right? So imagine the versioning nightmare that you can have in there, right? Imagine how complex it is to manage a service or an architecture with hundreds of thousands of microservices all running in an orchestrated way, going to deployment, going to production in a continuous way for each of those microservices, making sure that everything is orchestrated. That's the challenge of that architecture, right? And that's where you can think of the Azure Container Service as the basic infrastructure for that, and then the rest as additional level of abstractions for that. So microservices, you realize that I didn't mention the other buzz word of the year, which is of the almost decade, not decade, but at least a couple of years, which is containers, right? And that's because microservices and containers are different things, right? But the reality is that containers is a very straightforward implementation that you can use for implementing a microservice architecture, right? So that's why usually you will see that they come together a lot. And when you say container, usually the next word is, of course, Docker, right? Docker is the de facto standard for creating containers, right? So let me show you this thing here. So how do we connect microservices with containers? Why are they always so close? The reality is that one of the challenges that you will have when you're creating a microservice architecture is how you package that microservice. So you need to make sure that the microservice is lightweight. So imagine that a potential implementation of microservices, you could say, is every microservice is one server. Nightmare, right? So there's no way that you can manage that. If you need to spin a new server every time that you deploy a microservice, that's crazy. The next thing could say, yeah, I want to create VMs, right? Not a great idea either, right? Because microservices, you have hundreds of thousands of microservices, so you need high density of microservices, and VMs are not providing you high density per server, right? So you need something lighter, and that something lighter could be a container. So containers are very lightweight implementations of an isolation technology that allows you to run multiple containers on a single server, and that's great. The other big news about containers is that it can be packaged in the developer machine or anywhere, and that thing directly you can move it between or across environments, right, without making any modification. That is interesting, right? So that means that the whole thing of, hey, it's running in my machine, but it's not running in production, that shouldn't be the problem with containers, because you can create a container in development, and that can go to production, right? You're physically shipping that container, right? So when you bring the two things together, that's powerful for microservices. So in our case, so what you can think of Visual Studio and containers, in this case I'm using .NET, but again, could be any technology. So the cool thing about containers is that you can create that container in your development machine or on places like VSTS, right, on a central CI system. And that same container, you can decide to deploy to Azure, or you can decide to deploy on premises to either Linux and Windows Server. And with .NET Core, you can do that, right? So you can target Linux containers, or you can target Windows containers. And the same container can flow through all your development process. So then this gets complex, right? So what is the level of complexity here? There's not only one microservice. There's going to be many microservices. So in this case, I have 5 microservices, each of them done in a different technology. So you have even Java, Ruby, whatever. You can create microservices on any technology, right? So now the tricky part is how do I set up what I saw in the mobile piece, that continuous integration and continuous deployment with containers? How do I set that up, right? Not easy, right? So what you can do, and that's what VSTS, what Visual Studio Team Services, is enabling you to do now, is shipping or orchestrating that whole continuous integration process. So this is how it works. So you go to Visual Studio. In Visual Studio, you use any of those technologies to create the container. In this case, I'm going to create .NET, right? You create that container in there. You can test the container, etc. You can do everything that you want with that container. But then, once I push the code to my Team Services repo, that is going to trigger the build, right? Just like regular. It will trigger the build in my continuous integration server. And what VSTS can do for me is packaging that container, or multiple containers, I have multiple services, and deploy those containers to my development environment or even to my production environment, right? So that's all that orchestration is what Team Services can do for you. And then you can deploy that to a service like Azure Container Service, which is the orchestrator in production for those containers that allows you to scale them, to monitor them, to manage them, to administer them, etc. Right? So that's the magical combination. So I told you that I was going to go deeper in a couple of places. This is one of them, right? So now I'm going to go deeper here, right, for you to see the power of this. So I'm going to start, as I was mentioning before, with a very simple ASP.NET project, right? And in this ASP.NET project, I'm going to create, so I'm doing here, let me show you what I'm doing. I'm saying that the solution is called My Containers app. And that solution is going to have, at the beginning, it's going to have only one project, which is a web application. I'm going to start with one single application here. Did I create this application before? Let me check very quickly. Demos, containers. Let me do it here in this folder. There you go. OK. So on this application, I'm going to create a web application. So simple ASP.NET Core web application without any authentication. OK. That is going to create the application. So I won't go into the details of the ASP.NET coding here, but let me just show you. Oh, this was because of the summary thing open. Let me check. OK, let me just show you that this is a web application with a controller in here. This is the template for ASP.NET Core application. And if I run this application locally, and this will run on IIS. Let me start closing. OK, so this is my application, right? So it's running locally, so I can do this. So what I'm going to do is when I click on About, I'm going to just show in here, let me show this. This is basically using, is getting the OS, the description for the OS that I'm running on, right? Just to understand which OS I'm running on. And I'm going to run this again. And when I click on About, it will show Windows 10. Come on, About, Windows 10. So far, simple, right? No containers involved. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to package this as a container locally. So still nothing about continuous integration. So let's start easy, right? So the easiest way to do that, let me just pin this thing, is I can right-click, add Docker project support. That easy. When I have that, what it's basically doing is adding a couple of files. One of them is this Docker file that you see here that is defining. So this file is defining the container. So it's telling it, hey, get this image from Docker Hub, right, from the repository of containers, right? So you have images for a lot of Microsoft technologies, and you have several images for ASP.NET Core that you can reuse. And then in there, copy my application and execute it, right? That's it. So once I have that, now when I run this thing, you see that it's now showing Docker in here, so let's debug this application. Now, this is tricky. So now this application is running inside a container, right? So the container is being packaged, that container is running, and I'm able to debug that container from Visual Studio, right? Now, the interesting part of it, if I click on About, no, this was the wrong one. Let me do it again. Okay, so you saw that I can break my code, right? So breakpoints work, exactly the same. But now the funny thing is that if I hover my mouse here, Linux, right? So now this whole container is a Linux container. I can create a Windows container, but this is a Linux container, and I'm running it locally in my Windows machine. Now, what do I do with that? So now I have my container. So without even going into the CI system, what I can do directly with that container is that I can deploy it to Azure directly, right, from my development machine, and it's the same container that is deployed into Azure, right? How do I do that? So I'm going to go in here, again, right-click, Publish. And in Publish, let's create a profile. I'm saying that I'm deploying this thing on a Linux app service, okay? This will, let's wait for it to pop up. Okay, let's use this resource and create. It ends in 24, right? So this is creating now an app service on my Azure subscription, right? And that app service is going to be the host for me to deploy that container, right? So if I come here, this is done. So I have here my new application, my new app service that it was just created. So far, so good. And now I'm going to deploy my application. So what this thing is doing, I'm going in the meanwhile, you saw that I'm going to this configuration of that app service. What this is doing right now is compiling my application, put it in a container, push that container to Azure, to a registry in Azure in the meanwhile, and then getting that from here, right? So it is hosted on app service. That's basically what it's doing. So once that is done, this is the configuration that is now changing. So Visual Studio is going here and changing that configuration to point to my image. Once that is done, this is the new website, and it's running as a container in Azure. So this is the simplest way for you to create a container, right? That simple. And now that container, you can do whatever you want with it. You can move it to any Linux, or to any on-premise or a cloud. Now, let's make it a little bit more complex, right? So the next step that you will usually have with containers is that you will have more than one container. So let me add another service in here. Let me close all of this. I'm going to do right-click, add, new project. And in this case, I'm going to call it service 1, okay? I'm going to say that it's a web API. And directly, I'm going to say enable, well, let me do it by hand. So I have this service in here. Let's do the same thing, add Docker support, done. It will create, so this is telling VS to create a container for this service. Now I have 2 containers. I can also now orchestrate the 2 containers. So I'm going to say add solution support. And what that is doing, let me show it to you. Docker solution support is creating this other file. So this file is even higher level, right? So now this is defining all the different services in my application. So with this file, I can take now this file and take it to an orchestrator like ACS, Azure Container Service, and I can deploy this application, right? It would be exactly the same, but in this case, multiple containers. So far, so good. Now, the difficult part is not that. The difficult part is how do I set my DevOps continuously so this is going to work every time that I modify the code, right? And for doing that, what I have is right-click here, configure continuous delivery. So what this is doing is it's taking all these microservices, it's taking all the solution that I created, and it's going to set up a continuous integration environment for me. So every time that I change anything in this code, it's going to do all this stuff in the cloud, right? It's going to take my code, it's going to build and package those different containers, and it's going to deploy those containers to Azure. So I can continuously improve and continuously deploy my application, right? I'm not going to execute it. This will take a while. But at the end, what you're going to have is a system like this. You're going to have first thing that you're going to have is an ACS. So this is an ACS. This is Azure Container Service that you can see that it has a release in there, Demotech Summit, that is pointing to my repo in VSTS. That's all that it's doing. And then the other thing that it's doing is in my VSTS, if I go here and I see my builds, this is one of the builds that I have. You see that my build in the server is creating that Docker image for me. So it's taking the code, creating the Docker image, and then at some point, deploy it if I go here to release. Automatically for me. Let me go here. Where's edit here? You can see that is deploying to ACS, right? So that's everything that it's doing for me. So I have a very complex continuous integration scenario with just one click, right? Configure continuous deployment from Visual Studio. That would be like the going deep, deep, deep in that stack that we were pointing before. Right? So let me go back here for a second and let's do a step back. So what are the three things that we have seen in this session? So at the beginning, we saw creating those rich applications, right, for any device. And we saw how in the process of creating those applications, you need the agility that it can be provided by things like continuous delivery, right? And that was Visual Studio Mobile Center. Then on the other side, we saw how you can do the same thing, in this case, for the server side, with all the different levels of abstraction that will allow you to attach and to create any application that you want. And then how, no matter the level of abstraction that you pick, you can implement as well a continuous delivery mechanism with DevOps. That was it. I have 3 minutes, so I can get some questions if you want to. I think what we can do is close it here. I will stay here on the stage. So if anybody has any question, because I don't see mics in the room, if anybody has any question, please come here, and I'm happy to stay here for more time. Thank you, guys.